How's it going, everyone? Once again, you're here back with the baddest chaplain. Hoping all is well with you and yours. I'm here speaking with Libby Stegger about Civic Bridgers. Libby, thank you so much for being here. How are you today?
Thank you so much for having me here, Chris. Doing really well. Excited to be here.
Terrific, terrific. So I just want to jump right in. Share the story behind Civic Bridgers. What inspired you to get started and involved with this very important work?
Chris, I started Civic Bridgers in 2020, late 2020. And in the lead up in that year, y'all will remember, it was a really divisive election. And I came to the realization for myself, probably midpoint through that year, that I was really polarized. And so the first step is realizing you have a problem. And so I realized that I was making assumptions about a lot of people that weren't really true or that I didn't have any real interaction with. And so I got curious about that. And I began to build relationships across differences of ideas and ideology. And I discovered something that was really surprising to me. Maybe not to other folks, but it was surprising to me that a lot of the people who I thought I was really at odds with, we actually often shared a lot of core values. We sometimes disagreed on how to get there. And so that was a really big realization for me. And at the same time, I'm from the Twin Cities in Minnesota. It's where I live. It's home. And that same year was when George Floyd was murdered here in the Twin Cities.
Right, right.
And I had this firsthand experience witnessing the extremes of fear and division. And at the same time, I also had this extraordinary opportunity to witness the unity that came from that moment when thousands of people came together to rebuild our community and to say, you know what, this can't happen again. Lots of people ask, what's my role in making the change? And that was really powerful to say, you know what, we might feel polarized, we might feel fear, we might feel division, but we all have a part to play in this. And that was really inspiring to me. And so that contrast really just showed me that bridging is possible. And that's why I started getting involved in the work. And then what happened from there, and then I'll be brief here, was that I found that as I looked out into the landscape, I was like, what are people doing about this sort of idea of polarization? And I found some really incredible initiatives, and a lot of them were dialogue based. And it's so important that we begin with dialogue. But what I didn't see enough of was, well, what do we do with that dialogue? Okay, so we're finding common ground. We're listening a little bit deeper. Like, how do we do the work of engaging in our communities with bridging at the center? And so Civic Bridgers is the manifestation of that, is trying to address that need. So we prepare young people to strengthen our democracy through bridging by being active in their civic life. And we do that through immersing them in learning experiences where the young people in our programs aren't just sitting and learning or just sitting and talking to each other. They're also engaging actively in the change that they want to see in the world by bringing people together across differences.
Now, that sounds like remarkable and timely, but dare I even say evergreen work of trying to help people understand they have more in common with folks that they've actively opposed for so long. And I really commend you on doing that. And thinking about doing that work, because the work is always contextual, and doing that work in the Twin Cities at the same time the unfortunate murder of George Floyd took place. Talk to me about how your life, your journey prepared you for that moment, right? So there's something about being in the place, but also about being prepared. So how did your personal and professional background shape this approach to civil discourse?
Yeah, it's such a great point. And that particular moment, I don't think life necessarily prepares you for that. That was a hard moment in our city and in our world. But I think I had gained some experiences through my professional and personal life that made me feel ready to say, well, this is something I want to go do. And before I started this, I had been in K-12 education and I was in administration. I know, Chris, you've been in K-12 as well, so maybe some of this will resonate. But that time really illuminated for me how very well-meaning, passionate, committed, smart people can actually become a roadblock when we don't work together well. So I watch these really talented educators, leaders, people who are passionate about serving students, and in particular, serving students for whom the system was dramatically underserving them. They were getting caught, and I should say I was part of this, we were getting caught in these cycles of blame and mistrust. We were like, here's an example. I had a close colleague and a friend. I was doing some fundraising work at the time, and we'd had some budget cuts. And so we had this big fundraising campaign for college access that was delayed as a result of these cuts, right? These things happen. We were doing our best. We were just getting ready to launch it. And this close colleague who was in the administration, in a meeting, she said, well, you must not care about students if you haven't gotten this done yet. And so it's this sort of micro
My
moment
goodness.
of going like,
Yeah.
huh, is that really what you think? There are, instead of saying, well, what's getting in the way and how can we
Right.
help? Or what do you
Hmm.
need? It was
Yeah.
jumping to the worst assumption. And those things were playing out time and again. And it was actually getting in the way of what we really wanted to do, which was like do the best for kids and serve them well. And
Yeah.
so what it helped me realize was that bridging in this moment is not exclusively about red and blue, right? It is actually this culture of division that's seeping into our ecosystem and our culture in ways that we don't always have the skills to address. And so in those moments, I learned that I was also able to go, let's take a beat. You just said something that feels really big. Do you really think that about me? And she was
Yeah.
able to,
Yeah.
I don't. I'm just frustrated that this hasn't
For
happened yet.
sure.
Right. So some of those moments were what helped tell me like, there is actually a different way that we can engage here, but we have a fork in the road. We have a choice that we can make. And it's why we've called Civic Bridgers, is because being a bridger it's an identity,
Yeah.
right? It's your life, it's your work life, it's your personal life. And we've got to show up with the values of being a bridger every day in all that we do, not just when we're faced with someone who deeply opposes us. I mean, this is everyday life and work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And a couple of things jumped out to me when you were saying this, Libby. Like, number one, just thinking about the way in which the times that we're in have made all of us so ready for a fight in every single case, right? So with this delay, your colleague was not assuming, to your point, oh, there's a way that Libby needs help. There's a way that, I can perhaps support this endeavor. It's like, no, I'm going to assume that the only reason this isn't done is because you don't care about the kids, which, as a former teacher, or a forever teacher, truly, that those are fighting words. You know what I mean? Like, we're in it for the children. And so thinking about the ways in which civil discourse gets impeded by our assumptions, like when you're speaking, what comes to mind for me is the ways in which like implicit and subconscious bias helps us make a snapshot judgment of people. Like, I don't need to hear you say a word. You don't need to hear me even say a word. All you need to do is see me, and I'm already preparing for whatever my assumptions about that person in that social location require me to prepare for. So given all of that, how do you feel like civil discourse can help us navigate today's climates? And what are sort of the obstacles to civil discourse that you can see? Because I feel like there's obstacles aplenty, you know?
There are obstacles aplenty. That is true. And I think you've hit the nail on the head that one of the biggest ones is the assumptions that we make, right? The assumptions that because someone voted a certain way, that means they believe a certain thing,
Mhm.
or because they voted a certain way that they are operating under the same set of narrative and facts that
Mhm.
you are, right? And that's
Mhm.
very often not true, not by intent. It's just by design. I mean, it's sort of just what's happening. So a lot of those assumptions are what's making it hard for us to come to the table. And we should acknowledge there are also real threats, both emotional and physical threats to people. And so, this is not about brushing over that and saying that it's not real and you should, go sit down with someone who is threatening your life or livelihood,
Right,
or
right.
your emotional well-being, right? You get to
Yeah.
choose those boundaries. But I do believe that there are often times when we are walking away from people who we really don't have as much in out of common as we do in common, right? We actually have a lot more common ground than we are choosing to see. And so we've got to choose those places to stretch a little bit and go, let me try to understand this a little bit better. Or let's get personal, right? Instead of making assumptions about them. Okay, well, why don't I get to know some people who hold that perspective and build
Right,
that as a
right.
relationship, right? Rather than casting a whole group of people as believing something. And so you asked, the first part of your question, Chris, was about, why is it so, like, why is it so crucial? What does this look like? And for us at Civic Bridgers, civic discourse it's, people use this word civil and civic, sometimes interchangeably.
Yeah, yeah.
Civil, I think so often, right? When we say like, be civil, if I say that to my children, it means like,
That's right.
simmer down, like, don't show
Yeah,
those
yeah.
emotions, like, don't get heated, right? Like, let's just
Sure.
like hold hands and talk quietly. And that's not
Sure.
what we mean, right? Like there is emotion behind a lot of this, and that's
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
It does what it looks like for us is that is about, we call it creating wells rather than
Mhm.
fences in our democracy.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
wells are gathering places. Traditionally, I don't happen to have a well that I go to here in St. Paul, Minnesota, but wells are traditionally gathering places where people come together from all different, some are further away, some are closer, different perspectives, different generations, right? But fences divide us into ideological camps, right? In today's climate, it looks like, we're increasingly building these fences where it's strict adherence to a specific set of beliefs, identities, right? That leads to echo chambers, deepening polarization, right? We know the story. Our democracy really requires that we build these wells where we can encounter different perspectives and that strengthen our decision making, right? Because you don't have to agree with everything you hear. You don't even have to act on everything you hear. But when you hear it and you deeply consider it, it makes it so much easier to make an informed decision that meets more people's needs. And so it's not about anything goes. It's not about abandoning our values. It's not about just saying like, let's compromise on everything and like, sort of meet in the middle. It's really about centering the idea of pluralism, the idea that pluralism is that the idea that multiple viewpoints have value, right? Not that you're going to do all of them or agree with all of them, but that they all matter because someone's holding them. Like that's someone's belief, for better or for worse, right? And so when we put that at the center, and that's our well then naturally we reject dehumanization, right? Because I value the fact that you have a perspective. I might not agree with it, but I value it. So I'm not going to dehumanize you. It rejects rigid thinking. It rejects the binary, the idea that like, if you're not this, you're that, right? As if there are only ever two sides. And it opens this opportunity for some productive disagreement. So that's really how we think about civil discourse in our work.
Here for it. So a couple of thoughts, one silly and one serious. Like the first was when we were talking about the wells. I thought, it's like, are people in Minnesota gathering around lakes, 1,000 lakes? This is my first thought. That's silly.
I like it. We do sometimes.
Sometimes, right? Sometimes. but on a more serious note, I hear you and I think about the value in communicating to people from the beginning that their perspective is appreciated and respected there. But I'm also thinking about, because of those echo chambers that we mentioned earlier, how further extreme viewpoints are becoming and how so often now a lot of viewpoints are being guaranteed by a particular violence, whether it's implied or very explicit threat of violence. So I don't know what to do with it. I don't know how to deal with this desire for pluralism that I share, that knows that there are some people in the room who I'm trying to invite to come sit at the table. And then some of them think if I don't have the dominant space at the table, I will destroy this table and everyone's sitting there. I don't know how we put in those safeguards, how we help people unlearn the need to have violence backing up their expression of self and expression of ideology. I'm trying to think about the ways in which we can unlearn that and help people disabuse themselves from that, but I'm at a loss. You know what I mean?
I hear you. And I appreciate you naming it because it's real and you're not the only one who's feeling that way. Lots of folks are feeling that way. It's real. Violence has no place in our civil discourse. So what I'm not saying is we should go and have a table where people get to stand up and say violent, dehumanizing things. That does not have a place here in our democracy. Right. And so we need to reject that. And not all violence is quite so overt, right? There are other ways, right? And so what I hear you saying is like, how do we invite people to that table? And I think what I would counter is to say, how do we co-create a table where everyone feels like they can express what's deeply held and that someone else can not necessarily validate it, but seek to understand it, right? So an example, I was at a community meeting recently and we had someone sort of question why there was this need for affinity groups, right? Like, how come they all get to have this like special space? Like, I feel left out. It was essentially what was being said. And of course, someone who was part of one of those affinity groups left, was like really hurt and offended by that total lack of understanding of why an affinity could matter. Affinity groups could matter. Well, we encourage them to come back together to really listen to each other, to seek that deeper understanding. And what they found through that was that at the heart of what both of them were seeking was belonging.
Right.
And they weren't experiencing that. And so that doesn't mean we shouldn't have affinity groups. It also doesn't mean that person was wrong for feeling left out, right? This was an emotion that they were expressing. So once they were able to see that, then they were actually able to create a space of broader belonging within our group.
Yes.
Right. So that, and now actually they work together incredibly well. And it's beautiful to see they didn't change each other's minds on all things, right? They still disagree on a lot of ideological things, but they were able to get at the heart of what people were seeking in that moment. And once we start from that deeper place, it helps. It's a start.
For sure.
It's a
For sure,
start.
for sure. So what would you say has been, and perhaps this anecdote you just shared is it, but what would you say is a success story where you've seen Civic Bridgers helping folks bridge this sort of deep divide that they experience?
Yeah, well, the story I just told absolutely is an example of that. I think we have this idea is that bridging is like this, like, I don't know, when Harry met Sally meets the West Wing. You've got like
That's perfect.
these
That's
two
perfect.
people who like can't stand each other, and then they
Right,
just
right,
like
right.
find their way to loving each other, and then they're best
Uh,
friends. They tackle like the world's biggest problems, right?
that's right.
If only it were true.
For real.
Real bridging it takes time, right? It moves at the speed
Yes.
of trust. And at the heart of all of this is trust.
Uh-huh.
And so it happens in these small moments, right? The moments of going like, oh, you said this thing and I find it hard to hear, but I'm going to be there to hear it. And I'm going to try to understand you, right? So those are the kinds of things. And then, what comes out of that, we have some of the young people in our programs there, they're building community initiatives,
Uh-huh.
right? So this is youth led. We don't tell them what to build. We don't tell them what to care about. They come with their
Right.
own existing beliefs and things they care about in their community. And we help them to envision what a civic action project could look like with bridging and pluralism at the center, right? As the well. And so some examples of things that are emerging from that, they can be really big, right? They can be things that are addressing what's happening in our political climate across the country.
Uh-huh.
Things that around immigration rights and things that are happening to their families. We also have a young person who said, you know what, I'm looking at the assets in my community and I'm realizing that there's this bike store that's between the middle school and the athletic practice spaces. And they sell beverages and none of my friends like them, right? Like
Come
we want
on. Yeah, yeah.
different drinks, right? So I'm
Yeah.
going to get my community together and say like, what kinds of drinks do we want? We're going to go and chat with the owner of the store and we're going to try to
Right.
make something happen. Okay, well,
There it
is
is.
this like, yeah, is this turning over, like an entire society? No, but it is a meaningful change for the people in that community.
Yeah.
It's also helping young people know that they have agency. It's also helping build a relationship between the shop owner and a young person who might not have spoken to each other otherwise, right? Like
Right.
these are the things. So I think sometimes we think that like bridging divides is this moment or
Uh-huh.
that civic engagement is like so hard. It can
Yeah.
be in these micro moments, but it actually builds trust and it builds our sense of agency. And right now, the problems that we're facing are so big that I think a lot of us are losing that feeling of agency. We need to
Absolutely.
rebuild that and we need to make sure we build it for our young people.
Absolutely. No, I love this example that you shared, Libby, so much because I think people forget or haven't learned that all change happens locally, and there's something about, you know, forgive the baseball analogy, everyone's trying to hit a home run, but no one's getting on base. And sometimes you just got to get on base. And we can't worry about trying to just like the most spectacular move when it has to really start with you talking to the store owner and saying, here are the beverages that my community wants, that will actually ultimately help that store owner, right? Like they want to have the business of the community, so it all makes sense. But it has to start small and it has to start locally. So thank you for lifting.
I love that, this get on base, right? I think we are in a society that is rife with hero stories. And gosh,
Right,
they feel so
right,
good, right? But it doesn't make us
absolutely,
all feel like, well, then we're not doing something if we're not saving the day, if we're not the
totally,
hero of society. But getting on base is it like that's a team sport.
yeah,
Democracy is a team sport. So we
it
all have
is
to do our small part and then something great will happen.
truly, truly, and to your point about the hero veneration in our culture, it allows people to say, well, I'm not Dr. King, so I can't do anything. Like we start to take ourselves
Yeah.
out of the game, and it doesn't honor the tiny people, the people we didn't learn about in any history classroom who helped so much that Dr. King wouldn't have been able to do his work. Any great person of any time wouldn't have been able to do their work without those regular, everyday people who demonstrated courage in their own way. And I think
Yeah,
there's
they did.
space for all of us in this work. And I love it, the way you described it, that democracy is indeed a team sport.
Beautiful. That's spot on, right? Dr. King wouldn't have been able to move anything forward if not for every person who showed up
Right.
time and again in different
That's it.
communities in different ways. So there's I encourage people to think about what's your locus of control, right? Like
Yes.
my locus of
Yes.
control is not the Supreme Court. Like I don't have any influence
No.
there.
No.
I
No.
don't know,
Right.
but I can think about what's happening in my own community and get involved
For
that
sure.
way.
For sure. Talk to me a little bit about social media and digital platforms because I'm of the mind, and this is not for hot take's sake, but I really don't think by the end of this decade we're going to have the same relationship with social media that we currently enjoy. I think countries have already started to place age restrictions on social media. I think people are going to go back to a much more offline way of moving very, very soon and only be online for the things they have to do, but not necessarily spend their free time there in the same way we were 10 years ago, even. But given all of that, I want to know what you think about how social media and digital platforms, how they have impacted civic dialogue. And frankly, this is not bias. Are they redeemable spaces for civic
Mm.
dialogue because they have contributed so much to the echo chambers and polarization we're experiencing?
Mm. You're right, they have. And at the same time, they also connect people across spaces. So for all
Mhm.
of the harm, there's also some good that comes from it, right? Just like with all things, it's nuanced. But
Right,
of
right.
course, it's easier. I mean, at the base level, like it's easier to say something nasty when it's behind a computer screen than
Yeah.
I was talking to this journalist recently that I really admire who would have people write just like the most horrible comments on stories. And she would
Right.
pick up the phone and call them. Okay, there you go. And she said to a T, every time they'd go, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't really mean it. Here's really what I
Right.
meant, where I'm coming from," right? Because when
Yeah.
you're talking to a human, we
Changes
naturally
things.
humanize. I know
Yeah.
it's a beautiful thing. So I don't know, Chris. I think we will have a different relationship with
Mhm.
digital media, social media, the internet, in 10 years. How could we not? We have a different relationship than 10 years ago. I mean, everything's evolving so quickly, but some version of it is here to stay. And
Yeah.
so this isn't say like, let's just go back to the time when we like had no internet, right? We actually need media
Mm.
literacy, right? We need digital literacy in the
Absolutely.
same way, but like we're not teaching that very effectively, very deeply in school. So that is actually embedded into our programming for teens. Is we begin very early with them with talking about digital and not digital literacy, really media literacy. How can
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
understand the narratives and see who's saying what and really
Mhm.
dig into that around an issue that you care about?
Yeah.
And then how do you build the skills to engage effectively online, right? Like actually, how can you be a depolarizer, a bridger in a digital space? Because for a lot of Gen Z right now, the digital world is the real, like that's
That's so
their
true.
orbit, right? Like, so
Yes.
we can't just sort of like wag a finger and say, oh, this is so bad. If we want to
Mm.
do something about it, we got to do something about it. And if we're going to do something about it, we got to have Gen Z at the table. And so that's our hope by
Absolutely.
really deeply embedding this kind of media literacy into our programming and having young people take action and agency so that it is a tool and not a crutch, but so that it is
Yeah.
something that they can use for their bridging purposes, then hopefully it will become a better space. But we've got to, I mean, it's, we need a groundswell in order to make
Yeah.
that shift.
I'm right there with you. Yeah, I love that you talk about the importance of making sure Gen Z and shoot Gen Alpha is right
They're
there
right
too in
around the
terms
corner, aren't they?
right around the corner. They are prepubescent as we speak, and so there's definitely a need to make sure that all generations are involved in this sort of decision making. Because to your point, we're talking with respect to Gen Z and Gen Alpha, generations who can't remember a before time. Like they don't remember that AOL CD-ROM that with the 10 hours on it to
Sure.
get online and dial
Came
up.
in the mail.
It came in the mail. That's not part of their life. That's not part of their life. So it's absolutely critical that young folks are a part of the conversation too. Uh, as I think about all the ways that online conversations absolutely can be humanized when you pick up a phone call, or pick up a phone or interact with a person face to face, I'm wondering if you have any tools or strategies, especially for that like online or perhaps even offline, because there are people who are brave enough to say something very terrible to you face to face as
Yeah.
well. What techniques or even phrases do you sort of keep in your pocket when conversations get to that tense, almost boiling over point?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think for any hard conversation, try to reset your goals to be one of understanding, right? So my goal is not to convince, it's not to change your mind, it's to understand. And that to me is a benchmark of success. If I walk away from a hard conversation and I understand you better, what a gift. What a gift, right?
Truly.
And so when I orient that way, where my goal is to understand, then that leads my question asking. So that leads my like, help me understand. Or like the moment with the colleague who said he didn't care about children, right? Is that what you really like? Is that what you think of me? Like, let's take a beat. Just help me see it and from your perspective, or how can we work together on that? Right. Those kinds of questions are inviting people in rather than being like, how dare you? Or didn't you read that statistic that said this or that? Right. Like that that's a convincing method. And there's a time and a place for it. But often in those difficult, heated conversations, that's not one of them. So help me understand, help me like see why this matters to you so much, or tell me a story about a time when this really came, that helped change your mind on this, or help form your ideas, right? Sometimes getting to that root of that can really, really help. I'd also say though, Chris, like we get to choose our own tent, and there are times when preserving the bridge means taking a pause. And it is okay to go like, I think we've spent as much as we can right now, and to close it respectfully. Like I can only say it if this is true, but like, I'd love to re-engage with you on this once I've had a minute to calm down, or an hour or a day or a week or whatever you need,
some
right?
time.
I need some time with this so that I can come to you with a fresh space. That's okay. And it's also okay if that's repeatedly not happening, to say like, here is my line and here's what I need from you in order for us to continue this conversation. I'll be ready when you're there. But like, we don't build a bridge just to burn it down. And so people aren't always ready, right? So you might be building a bridge and they might be sending some hard balls back at you. And it's okay to say, I think this isn't getting us any further, but like, let's come back to it when you're ready to meet these expectations that I have for my self-worth and dignity. So ground rules are important. Seeking to understand is really important. And knowing when you can respectfully walk away is important.
For sure. There's so much of what you're saying, Libby, that makes me think about inner voice and the way that's formed from the time like you're a young person, probably like within the womb up to about age 5 or so. Your inner voice is being formed, the way in which you self-talk, the way in which you emotionally regulate. Because as you're saying all this, I'm thinking about my own work with people who've gone through levels of trauma that makes it very difficult to do what you said. Talking about like I have worked with folks who would have gotten very like visibly furious with someone, who disrespected them, because that's all they would hear. So they wouldn't hear it as a disagreement, they would hear it as disrespect. And I'm curious, in your own estimation, how can individuals improve their own skills in civil discourse? Because it seems from my vantage point that so much of civil discourse is also tied not just to a level of maturity, but to a level of having engaged and dealt with whatever trauma, whatever emotional dysregulation you may have had and accumulated over your journey, to be able not to take it to a very disrespectful place when someone has been disrespectful, or when someone's been like violently disagreeable.
That's such a beautiful question, and it comes with so much compassion. I really appreciate it, Chris. And
no doubt.
It sounds like they should call you is what they should do when they're feeling that. But no, I mean it. I think, phone a friend, which some Gen Zers might not other folks might not understand that reference, but phone a friend.
Right.
And I think there are a couple resources. So one is, if you're finding that in those moments you're feeling really dysregulated, certainly there are faith leaders who can help like you. There are mental health professionals who can help. And so if you're feeling like that's happening all the time, even in trusted spaces, that might be a place to turn. If it's happening for you in spaces where like you're in civil and civic and public life and where things are coming to this head, it might be about practicing a little bit with someone where it isn't so public, it isn't so heated, it's someone that you trust, or they're being a straw man, right? Or so that you can have a little bit of practice, right? And take a beat and ask those questions. I think that can really help. There are also a lot of great, as I mentioned at the top, there are a lot of great organizations that help you practice these conversations. I'm not sure they would appreciate me calling it practice because it's actually a real life conversation. So groups like
For
Braver
sure.
Angels or Living Room Conversations has facilitation guides, right? Things like
Mhm.
that are really, really powerful and strong. And so if people are interested in just getting some more experience and practice at this, those are some great resources to turn to. Once people are ready for the more active doing, right, that's when to bring in Civic Bridgers, right? Because we're about helping to build those skills and mindsets for bridging, but also about getting out there and doing it in the community.
For sure. For sure. And with regard to, Civic Bridges doing this work in the community, like I think about just the different tone I've had to employ when I'm doing workshops, whether it be for, faith communities, the government, education. Like, talk to me about your experience with these different arenas of society and the ways in which, if you were to kind of go in and not necessarily diagnose, but just the ways you notice how you have to sort of deal and engage differently when you're in a government space versus like a business space or educational space. Like, what are the commonalities and what are like the distinctions that you know?
That's such a good question. It's sort of like people, right? Institutions
Mm-hmm.
are not people, but they behave that way because they are built by humans.
That's
And
right.
so
That's right.
just like if I'm approaching an individual, I've got to understand what motivates them, what's on their
Mhm.
mind, what
Yeah.
stressors they have. I got to do the same thing
Yeah.
with our institutions, right? So like what's at the heart of the dynamic that's happening here? What's the organizational culture? What are the risks and dangers? And so there are some organizations um, that will consult for institutions like that and help them navigate that. And I'm happy to share some of those resources afterwards with listeners, and who will come in. And what they often will do is they'll have one-on-one meetings with everyone involved beforehand, right? Because then you get to say, so what's at play here? What's at stake? What are the risks? What
Yeah.
are the
Yeah.
different things that I should be knowing about? Because again, our institutions are reflections of people. And so we've got to know the people before we can really figure out how the institution operates.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. As you look at the current landscape and all the work that needs to be done, where do you see Civic Bridgers in 5 years? Like, we're recording in 2025. Where do you see your organization in 2030?
Yeah. So our goal is that in 5 years, we'll have launched 10,000 Civic Bridgers. So
My
Civic
goodness.
Bridgers I know. It's a big goal. It's ambitious, but achievable.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
Civic Bridgers to us are leaders who make change by bringing people together in common cause, and who
Mm.
model in everything they do, their public life, their private, and their digital life too, that they
Yeah.
model the values of pluralism, which really are humanity, humility, and accountability, right? How do we see the humanity in others and honor that and honor people's dignity in all that we do? How do we have the humility to have, I call it, have close beliefs loosely held, right? So like,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? I can believe strongly in something. I can also say like, teach me what you're thinking so that I can
Right.
be open to my mind being changed. Doesn't mean I'm always
That's
going to
right.
change my mind, but I gotta listen to other perspectives.
For
That's
sure.
the humility piece of it. And then
Yeah.
accountability, right? Like we all have accountability for each other, in
Uh-huh.
any society and in a democracy, especially. And so I think a lot of times when we hear accountability, we hear apology, and that is a piece of it. When we cause harm, we
Yeah.
apologize.
That's
But it
right.
also means that I look out for the person next to me, whether or not
Mm.
they agree with me. And
Uh-huh.
so those things together we see as what makes a civic bridger. And so our goal in 5 years, in 2030, if you can believe that it will be 2030 in five
Come
years,
on.
is these 10,000. So like imagine 10,000 young people, right? So we work with young people who at the moment are 14 to 25, right? In 5 years, they're going to be even older than that. We're going to have a group of alums who are there to support them. And they're not just one individual. They are this collective of civic
Uh-huh.
bridgers who share an identity. They are also going out into the world as civic leaders, as professionals, as private citizens who are showing up every day in this way. And so the ripple effects can be tremendous, really all
Uh-huh.
across the country.
Uh-huh.
And so that's the dream, is that then they will be building spaces that are bringing people together across differences, that they'll be modeling this for other people, and that they'll be helping other people see that this work is possible, that bridging isn't this like chore, right? That it
Right.
is a
Right.
joyful act, and that we can have a more vibrant civic society when we show up.
Yeah. That's wonderfully said. That is wonderfully said. So a young person who's watching this and is thinking, I want to start doing this sort of work. They're excited about what you're saying, and they're thinking about all the difficult conversations they have to have on an everyday basis. What's one piece of advice that you would give them?
Listen to understand. I mean, it sounds simplistic. It sounds um, almost trite. It is revolutionary when we can really, really listen. So you've got that teacher who's in your face all the time or whatever it is.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, let me just take a minute and like think about what might be going on for that person or ask them what might be going on for them. Like, oh my goodness, then what we could get done together. You know, you might actually be able to change your whole classroom climate as a result. You might be able to change your school.
Yes.
Right. So
Yes.
these are the kinds of things, but it has to start from that place of listening to understand.
Yeah, that's really the truth. You saying that reminds me of how many students I had who I would see them having static with another teacher. You know, I'd say, hey, like, what's going on? I was like, hey, what's going on? They're like, well, they don't respect me, so I don't respect them. And it makes me think how it's really incumbent on us as the adults, as the elders, to establish exactly what you're saying, that culture of respect. Because on the other side of it, when I had a student who was out of pocket, I would often say to them, like, yo, I don't come to you with disrespect. Like, I was like, I've never disrespected you. I have no intention to disrespect you. Like, let's find a way to, vibe and be respectful to each other. And I found it to be so much more effective than the contrary of trying to get the last word and trying to, you know, dominate the space and all that. There's something about the humility to listen, to understand, as you're describing it, that really does help so much and really can transform the way that we engage each other overall, for real.
Oh, absolutely. I love that. I mean, you created a space by showing that humility and just acknowledging it and inviting the conversation, right? And
Uh-huh.
I imagine this didn't happen for you, but for some people, a student might say, actually, you have disrespected me. And you didn't know, maybe because maybe
Yeah,
there were different norms, or you were having
sure.
a day and you kind of forgot, but like I didn't forget, I'm
That
holding on
happens too.
to it. And you're right,
Yeah,
it is incumbent on the adults, right? So the adults in the room need to create respect. As I zoom out on society, I'm like, the adults in the room are not modeling this behavior.
not at all.
And so what I would say to young people is, yeah, you're right. The people in power, and often people have more power through age, but not always,
Right, right.
need to be modeling this. And when they're not, young people can acknowledge that they have power too.
Yeah,
And they can exercise
absolutely
that.
they
And
do.
in some of these moments, it can be by inviting the teacher for that conversation or inviting a classmate for that conversation
Sure.
or, any number of other ways to build their collective power. And so that's also when a group like Civic Bridgers can come in, right? And there are lots of different organizations in people's hometowns and things like that that can help young people to actually create a plan for how to make change in their communities. And so that would be where we'd start. So like our Beyond Civics programs is for high schoolers. So sort of the
Mhm.
14 to 18-year-old range. It's a 10-week program. It's like an hour and a half every week. So it's not a ton of time. And we help
Mhm.
young people to actually create a community action plan. And that can look like the bike store, right? And changing the drinks. It can
Yes,
look
yes.
like helping to create resources for your community in the face of changes to immigration policy, like know your rights. This is the
Yeah,
thing that
right.
young people in our programs are talking about. And that can look however they want it to look. It happens in Minneapolis, it's going to look really different than what's happening in Richmond or in Atlanta
Sure,
or,
for sure.
in Maine. And so this is a program that you can bring to your community and young
Mhm.
people can build what they need and want. And it helps them to see their own agency and to find their own power in a world that's telling them that they're powerless because they're really not.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. So how can people get involved with Civic Bridges? Like where, like someone's hearing this, they're rocking with it. They want to take that next step and get involved. What can they do, Libby?
Yeah, it's a great question. For the adults in the room, right? You can bring our program to your school, to your community spaces. So we've got the teen program that Beyond Civics. We've also got a higher ed program. So it's an urban rural immersion program bringing higher ed students into community with each other across
Mhm.
differences. And then we've got a fellowship, right? And so people can engage across any one of those. But for the adults, bring it to your community. Reach out to us. Let's find a way to work together. For the young people who are listening, sign up, right? So if you want to be in our fellowship, it's an early career fellowship. We're starting to accept applications now. It's for a full year of service. It's a paid experience. If you want to have an immersion program and cross-cultural experience, like call us, we can help facilitate it. And if you want to bring this to your school, let us know. And then of course people can go online and participate in lots of other ways. But if you're curious, check out our website and reach out. We'd love to have a conversation with you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I feel like this is perfect time with the application season starting now. Definitely take the time and see if this is for you. It sounds like a wonderful variety of options for you. So I definitely want to encourage everyone listening to apply themselves, or at least send this to a young person you know who definitely could benefit from this program for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. So check us out at civicbridgers.org and you'll find us there and be sure to reach out.
Absolutely, everyone, civicbridgers.org. Libby Stegger, thank you so much for your time. As always, you all can catch this at www.baddestchaplain.com. And thank you once again for just continuing to do your part. You know, as we said in this conversation, just starting locally, doing what you can, when you can, and where you can. All right, until next time, y'all, take care. Peace.